Larkins Ford, Wyoming Territory. Autumn 1887. The notice had hung on the gatepost for 6 days before Sarah Vantine let herself read every word of it. Foreclosure notice. Dry legal language. The bank's seal pressed dark at the bottom, and Warren Tolliver's signature under it all, small and neat, like a man signing his own name to a fact that had nothing to do with him personally. Sarah stood in the yard with the paper in her hand, and her daughter's fingers curled into the hem of her skirt, and she thought about how fast 10 months could turn a woman's whole life into paper. Michael had been gone since April, buried on the ridge above the house where he used to walk the fence line before first light. A rockslide had taken him during a spring storm, out-resetting a boundary marker that had worked loose over the winter. He had always been particular about boundaries. Said a man who did not know exactly where his land ended had no right calling any of it his own. Sarah had buried that carefulness alongside him, and in the months since she had learned it did not keep a roof paid for. The note Michael had taken the year before, for new breeding stock and a deeper well, had come due twice since his death. Twice she had scraped together enough to keep the bank patient. The third time, the patience ran out. 10 days left on the parcel folks in town called the Vantine Dry Quarter. Ground so thin and rocky that even Michael used to joke it grew more stone than grass. Sarah had never quite believed the joke. Neither had he, though it took her the better part of a marriage to understand why a man held so tightly to ground that gave back so little for so much sweat. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Sarah Vantine was 32 years old, dark-haired, with the kind of steadiness in her hands that came from 10 years of frontier work rather than any natural calm. She had grown up in a Missouri farmhouse with 6 brothers and had come west at 22 already knowing how to birth a calf, mend a harness, and go 3 days without complaining about anything at all. Michael had courted her with wildflowers picked along the North Platte and a stubborn kind of patience that matched her own, and together they had built a life on 1,100 acres of high, dry ground that everyone else in the valley considered too poor to bother fencing. Her daughter Ivy was 7, quick and watchful in the way children get when they have learned early that grown-up trouble does not always stay behind closed doors. Since her father's death, Ivy had taken to following Sarah everywhere on the ranch, small boots in her mother's footprints, as though staying close enough might keep one more person from disappearing. Sarah did not have the heart to tell her that closeness had never once been the thing that kept a person safe out here. She only had the heart to keep working, because the alternative was sitting still long enough to feel the whole weight of it. The ranch itself sat at the northern edge of the valley, where the grass thinned and the rocks started pushing up through the soil in gray shoulders, and where the wind off the mountains never seemed to stop entirely, not even in July. Michael had bought the land cheap from a homesteader who gave up after 2 dry summers, and he had spent a decade proving, mostly to himself, that hard ground could still be made to answer for a man's labor if he was stubborn enough about it. He had never explained to Sarah exactly why he cared so much about the upper section, the rocky shoulder above the house where the old boundary stakes ran, except to say once, late at night with the lamp burned low, that a man's grandfather had taught him the value of knowing precisely what belonged to him and precisely what did not. Sarah had thought it was only pride talking. She had not thought much more about it until the bank came calling. Warren Tolliver ran the Larkins Ford Trust and Loan with the careful patience of a man who understood that patience, properly managed, always cost him less than it appeared to. He had given Sarah 2 extensions already, each one accompanied by a small speech about the difficulties of a widow managing land alone. Difficulties he seemed to regard as facts of nature rather than anything requiring the bank's flexibility. By the 3rd missed payment, his patience had a hard edge to it. He rode out himself in early October, hat in hand, voice gentle, and told her the note would be called due in full within 10 days, the parcel to be surveyed and sold at public auction the week after if she could not produce the balance. "I have worked this land every day since April," Sarah told him, standing in her own doorway with Ivy half hidden behind her skirts. "I have not asked the bank for a single day of grace, beyond what it already gave me." "The bank's patience is not unlimited, Mrs. Vantine," Tolliver said, not unkindly, though the effect landed the same as if he had been unkind about it. "Whatever sympathy I feel personally for your circumstances, the note comes due, and the land will need a proper survey before any sale can go forward. I would rather see it settled cleanly than dragged through the territorial court." The Vantine dry quarter had a reputation in Larkin's Ford long before the foreclosure notice made that reputation official. Ashford Doane, who ran nearly 4,000 head on the largest spread in the valley, had made a habit for years of remarking, at the mercantile or after church, or wherever a crowd might overhear him, that Michael Vantine's stubbornness about that rocky upper section was the one foolish thing he had ever done. Doane's cattle grazed the open range that bordered the Vantine land to the north, and had for as long as anyone could remember drifted onto the high shoulder above the house, to drink from a spring near the ridgeline, a spring nobody in the valley had ever bothered to survey properly, because nobody imagined a spring on worthless ground was worth the trouble of arguing over. After Michael died, Doane's remarks took on a different flavor, less amused and more practical, the talk of a man doing arithmetic in his head about what a foreclosed parcel might fetch at auction if the right people understood beforehand just how little it was actually worth. He never said as much outright. He did not need to. In a town the size of Larkin's Ford, an opinion repeated often enough by a man of Doane's standing became something very close to settled fact, whether or not it had ever been tested. By the second week of October, Sarah could feel the town's judgment settling over her like weather. The women at the mercantile grew careful and a little too kind, the particular kindness people extend to someone they have already decided is finished. The schoolteacher asked after Ivy with a gentleness that felt like pity, dressed up as concern. Old Simmons at the feed store, who had extended credit to half the valley at one time or another, told her plainly that he could not extend any more, not because he doubted her word, but because everyone in Larkin's Ford had already priced the Vantine place at nothing, and a man in his position could not afford to bet against the whole town's arithmetic. Sarah heard the word stubborn more than once, always attached to Michael's memory, sometimes attached to her own, as though holding on to hard ground after her husband's death were a kind of foolishness that ran in the family rather than a debt she had simply not yet found a way to pay. At the mercantile on a Saturday morning, two ranch wives fell quiet the moment Sarah stepped through the door, the particular quiet that told her plainly they had been discussing her before she arrived. One of them, a Mrs. Prentice whose husband ran cattle along the southern boundary, offered her a smile so careful it looked almost painful, and asked, in a voice pitched to Carrie, whether Sarah had given any thought yet to where she and the girl might settle once the bank took the place. Sarah bought her flour without answering, counted her coin twice to be certain of it, and walked the 2 miles home with Ivy's hand in hers, rather than accept the ride Mrs. Prentice offered afterward, out of guilt more than kindness. She did not tell Ivy what had been said. She had run out, by then, of ways to explain a town's pity to a child young enough to still expect fairness as the ordinary shape of things. Doane himself said nothing to her directly that week, which she had come to understand was its own particular cruelty, a man secure enough in the outcome that he no longer needed to trouble himself with unkindness in person. She did not argue with any of it. Arguing cost energy she did not have to spare, and besides, there was a particular exhaustion in trying to convince a whole valley that the ground under your feet was worth more than its reputation. She kept working instead, mending fence, tending the few head of cattle she had left, stretching what little credit remained, and she told herself that dignity, at least, was still hers to keep even if the land was not. The survey crew arrived on a cold gray Tuesday morning, 3 days before the notice's deadline. Tolliver had arranged it through the Territorial Land Office, a formality required before any foreclosed parcel could be legally auctioned, since the old county plat for that stretch of the valley had never been properly reconciled with the original government survey from the 60s. Sarah watched from the porch as 2 wagons pulled up the rutted track, one carrying chain and transit equipment, the other carrying a single man, who climbed down slowly and stood for a long moment, simply looking at the land before he said a word to anyone. His name was Gideon Marsh, a deputy surveyor out of Cheyenne, 34 years old, quiet in the particular way of a man who had spent most of his working life reading ground rather than people. He introduced himself to Sarah with his hat off and his eyes steady, and he told her plainly that his job was to walk the original section corners, reconcile them against the county's more recent plat, and produce an accurate acreage and description ahead of the sale. He said it without apology and without unnecessary sympathy, which Sarah found, after 2 weeks of the town's careful pity, to be its own kind of relief. "I will need several days," he told her. The original survey from '63 used stone mounds and witness trees for its corners, and some of those markers have likely shifted or gone missing entirely in 24 years. I would rather walk it properly than guess. Take whatever time the job requires, Sarah said. I have nothing left to lose by your being thorough, Mr. Marsh, and a good deal to lose if you are not. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she could not quite place, something closer to respect than she had gotten from most people in recent weeks, and then he set to work. Gideon Marsh had grown up the son of a government surveyor in the Kansas Territory, following his father across half the plains with a chain and a notebook before he was old enough to understand what any of it was for. His father had taught him early that a boundary line was not an opinion. It was a fact, fixed in the ground by men who had walked it and measured it and driven a stake or piled a mound of stone to mark it. And no amount of convenient talk in town could change what those stakes actually said if a man took the trouble to find them again. Gideon had watched more than one family lose land, or gain it unfairly, because nobody had bothered to walk the original corners, before trusting a county plat drawn up secondhand by a clerk who had never once set foot on the ground he was describing. He had made a quiet private rule for himself, somewhere in his 20s, that he would never sign his name to a survey he had not walked himself, start to finish, whatever the weather or however long it took. He spent the first 2 days walking the southern and eastern boundaries of the Vantine parcel, chain men working ahead of him, his own eyes on the old field notes he carried in a worn leather case, notes copied from the original '63 government survey before he left Cheyenne. Those lines matched the county plat closely enough. It was the northern boundary, the rocky upper shoulder where Michael Vantine had died resetting a marker the winter before, that gave Gideon pause. The county plat showed the northern line running due east from a stone mound at the section corner, a straight boundary that placed the ridge spring, and the grazing above it, outside the Vantine parcel entirely, on Ashford Doane's side of the line. But when Gideon walked that line himself, chain in hand, checking his father's old habit of triangulating from at least 2 witness points, rather than trusting a single marker, the stone mound he found did not sit where the county plat said it should. It sat nearly 400 feet south of the surveyed line, tucked against a shelf of rock that had clearly been there, undisturbed, since long before anyone in Larkin's Ford had settled the valley. Gideon walked the discrepancy 3 times before he trusted it. He compared his measurements against the original '63 notes, checked the witness tree described in that old survey, a lightning-scarred cottonwood that still stood, barely, at the edge of a dry wash, exactly where the notes placed it. He measured the bearing from that tree to the stone mound, and then from the mound along the original line, and the numbers matched his father's oldest lesson precisely. He worked through the figures twice more that afternoon, kneeling in the cold with his notebook balanced on his knee, the wind cutting down off the ridge hard enough to flutter the pages if he did not hold them flat with his forearm. He checked the chain length against the steel tape he carried for exactly this purpose, accounted for the slope correction the old field notes specified, and allowed for the shift in magnetic declination that had crept, by his own calculation, nearly a full degree in the 24 years since the original survey was walked. None of it changed the result. The stone mound sat where his father's habits told him a true corner ought to sit, undisturbed by weather or by any hand with reason to move it. Gideon had learned long ago that a survey either held up under 3 separate checks, or it did not hold up at all, and this one held. Someone, sometime in the intervening 24 years, had redrawn the county plat using a different, incorrect mound, likely one thrown up carelessly by a rancher's hand rather than a surveyor's, and the error had simply been copied forward, plat to plat, until nobody left alive remembered it had ever been anything other than fact. The corrected line, the one the original government survey actually described, ran nearly 400 feet north of where the county believed it ran, which meant the ridge spring and the grazing shelf around it, the water that Ashford Doane's cattle had been drinking from for years, without anyone ever questioning whose ground it sat on, belonged to the Vantine parcel after all, had belonged to it, properly, since the original survey was walked in 1863. Gideon sat on the stone mound a long while that afternoon, with his notebook open on his knee, looking at the spring below him, before he understood the full shape of what he had found. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything, and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. He told Sarah that evening, standing in her kitchen with his hat still in his hands, the same careful habit he had brought to every conversation since he arrived. He laid his notebook on the table and walked her through it plainly. The old cottonwood, the bearing from the tree, the true stone mound buried against the rock shelf, The 400 feet the county plat had gotten wrong for over 2 decades. "I would not tell you this if I were not certain," he said. "I have walked it 3 times. The original survey is clear, and the witness tree confirms it. The spring sits inside your boundary, Mrs. Vantine. It always has." Sarah sat down slowly across from him, the weight of it settling into her chest before her mind had entirely caught up to what it meant. "Michael," she said quietly, "he always said the upper section mattered more than anyone understood. He never told me why. I thought it was only stubbornness." Gideon looked at his notes again, and then, carefully, at her. "Your husband reset a boundary marker on that ridge the winter before he died," he said. "In a storm. It is possible he already suspected the line was wrong and was trying to fix it himself, without the proper equipment to prove it. Men who work land long enough sometimes feel a discrepancy before they can measure it." It was Ivy who found the strongbox 2 days later, tucked behind a loose board in the barn loft, where she had gone looking for a barn cat's new litter. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, sat Michael's original homestead papers from years before, including a hand-drawn sketch of the upper section with a note in his own careful hand describing the stone mound near the dry-wash cottonwood as the true corner, and a brief, unfinished letter to the Territorial Land Office requesting an official resurvey, a letter he had apparently never managed to send before the accident took him. "He knew," Sarah said, reading it at the kitchen table with Ivy leaning against her shoulder. "He knew, and he was trying to prove it the honest way, through the land office, not by making noise about it in town. He was a careful man," Gideon said. "Careful men do not always live to finish what they start. Sometimes it falls to whoever comes after them." Word reached Ashford Doane before Gideon had finished his official report, the way word always traveled fastest in Larkin's Ford, ahead of the facts rather than behind them. He rode out to the Vantine place himself 2 days before the scheduled auction, dismounting in the yard with the easy confidence of a man used to having conversations go his way. "I hear the surveyor found some confusion about the northern line," he said to Sarah, standing in her own yard as though the ground beneath his boots were a matter still open for negotiation. "I would hate for a widow in your position to get her hopes tangled up in a boundary dispute right before an auction. These things have a way of taking months to sort out in territorial court, months you do not have." "The survey is finished, Mr. Doane," Sarah said. "Mr. Marsh has already filed his corrected report with the county recorder. There is no dispute left to sort out. The line is where the original survey always said it was. Your cattle have been drinking from my spring for a good many years, without my husband ever once asking you to pay for the privilege." Doane's expression shifted, the easy confidence thinning into something harder underneath. "That spring has watered stock on the open range since before either of us settled this valley," he said. "A man does not lose the use of water his herd has always had, over a line some clerk drew wrong 20 years back. A man does exactly that," Gideon said quietly, stepping out from the barn doorway, where he had been checking a final measurement, "when the original government survey says the line was never his to begin with. I have walked it 3 times, Mr. Doane. I would be glad to show you the notes myself, and the witness tree, and the stone mound the county plat mistook for 24 years running. The corrected description is already a matter of public record at the courthouse. Any man in the valley is welcome to walk it and check my figures." The auction, scheduled for the following Saturday on the courthouse steps, drew a crowd larger than Larkin's Ford usually managed for anything short of a hanging or a wedding. Word of the surveyor's discovery had spread through the valley all week, in the particular breathless way that a genuine surprise moves faster than any ordinary gossip, and by the time Warren Tolliver climbed the courthouse steps to open the proceedings, half the town had already gathered to see how the matter would resolve. Tolliver read the notice aloud in the same flat, official voice he used for every foreclosure, the same voice that had told Sarah her 10 days were up a month before. He described the parcel by its old, familiar acreage, the acreage everyone in Larkin's Ford had spent years agreeing was worth almost nothing, and he called for opening bids. Gideon Marsh stepped forward from the crowd before anyone raised a hand, his notebook and the county recorder's newly filed copy of his corrected survey both held plainly where the whole square could see them. "Mr. Tolliver," he said, "before this sale proceeds, the court and every bidder present ought to know that the acreage and description you have just read are incorrect. I am prepared to submit the corrected survey, already on file with the county recorder as of Tuesday last, showing this parcel's true northern boundary, running 400 feet north of the line used in that notice." The correction includes a year-round spring previously assumed to sit on open range, a spring that in fact belongs, and has always belonged, to the Vantine parcel under the original government survey of 1863. The square went quiet the way a room goes quiet when everyone in it is doing the same arithmetic at once. Tolliver looked down at the notice in his hand, and then at Gideon's papers, and a slow, careful understanding crossed his face. The look of a banker realizing that every appraisal his office had used to calculate this sale had been built on ground that was, quite literally, drawn in the wrong place. This changes the value of the parcel considerably, Tolliver said finally, his voice losing some of its earlier flatness. It changes it entirely, Gideon said. A dry quarter with no reliable water is one kind of asset. 1,100 acres with the only year-round spring for 6 miles is another kind altogether. And every rancher standing in this square who has watered stock at that spring without paying for it these past 20 years understands exactly what I mean. Somewhere in the crowd, an older rancher named Pruitt, who had grazed a modest herd along the Vantine boundary for a decade, took off his hat and said, loud enough for the whole square to hear, that he for one had always wondered why Doane never once offered to buy that section outright if the land truly was worthless. A ripple of low conversation moved through the crowd at that, the particular murmur of a town quietly revising an opinion it had held, without much examination, for a very long time. Doane, standing near the front with his own bid already prepared, said nothing for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost the easy confidence it carried in Sarah's yard 2 days before. I made no secret of my interest in that section, he said stiffly. I never claimed to know the survey was wrong. You did not have to claim it, old Pruitt said, not unkindly, though the words landed with their own weight. You only had to let the rest of us believe it, and we did. Tolliver folded the notice slowly and set it down on the small table beside him. In light of the corrected survey, he said, the bank cannot in good conscience proceed with an auction based on a false valuation. I will need to reappraise the parcel properly before any sale goes forward, and given the corrected acreage and the water rights involved, I suspect the note itself can be restructured against a proper valuation rather than called due in full. Mrs. Vantine, I owe you an apology I did not expect to be making on these steps today. Sarah stood at the edge of the crowd with Ivy's hand in hers, and for the first time in a month she felt something in her chest loosen that she had not entirely noticed carrying until it eased. I do not want the note forgiven outright, Mr. Tolliver, she said, when the square had quieted enough to hear her. I want it restructured fairly, against what the land is actually worth, and I want the chance to pay it down properly, on my own schedule, the way any rancher in this valley would be allowed to. That seems more than fair, Tolliver said, and something in his voice suggested he meant it. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm Sarah had not expected to feel again so soon after April. Gideon Marsh's official duties in Larkin's Ford ended within a few days of the courthouse steps, his corrected survey filed, his report complete, no further reason under any ordinary circumstance for a deputy surveyor from Cheyenne to linger in a valley whose boundaries he had already set right. He found reasons anyway, a final check on a corner marker that did not, strictly speaking, require checking twice. A conversation with the county recorder about the proper language for the filed correction. A conversation that could easily have been handled by letter. He rode out to the Vantine place on a Thursday with no particular business at all, and Sarah, without quite deciding to, put on a second cup of coffee before he arrived, the way a person does when they have started expecting someone without admitting it to themselves. Ivy took to him quickly, the particular quickness of a child who recognizes a grown-up, willing to answer questions patiently and at whatever length the question required. Gideon taught her to read a compass properly within a week, and to understand, in simple terms, why a stone mound in the right place mattered more than a fence line drawn wherever seemed convenient. She followed him around the yard some afternoons, asking him to explain bearings and chains and witness trees, until Sarah gently reminded her that Mr. Marsh had likely answered enough questions for one day. I do not mind, Gideon told her once, watching Ivy run off toward the barn with a borrowed compass clutched in both hands. My father answered every question I ever asked him about a survey, however small, and it is the reason I know the value of walking a line myself, rather than trusting what somebody else already decided it said. Your father sounds like he taught you well, Sarah said. He taught me the one thing that matters most in this work, Gideon said, that the truth of a boundary does not change just because it would be more convenient for somebody if it did. A man only has to be patient enough and honest enough to go find it. On an evening in late November, with the first hard frost already silvering the grass along the ridge, Gideon found Sarah at the fence line above the house, standing near the spot where Michael had died the winter before, resetting the marker that had started this whole reversal without ever living to see it proven. He knew something was wrong here, Sarah said, when Gideon came to stand beside her. He never had the proof, only the feeling, and it cost him everything before anyone else understood he had been right all along. He left the proof anyway, Gideon said, in the strongbox, in the sketch, in the unfinished letter. He did not finish the work himself, but he made certain someone could finish it after him, if they were willing to look. Sarah was quiet a moment, looking out over the ridge, the spring below them catching the last low light of the afternoon. I built a whole decade of my life on land everybody else in this valley called worthless, she said, and I never once stopped believing my husband was right to hold on to it, even when I could not have told you why. I only wonder now what it would have cost me if you had never come to walk that line properly. I did not come here planning to find anything more than an accurate acreage, Gideon said. I have walked a great many boundaries in my life, Mrs. Vantine, and most of them turn out to be exactly where everyone already believed they were. This one did not. I am glad, more glad than I know how to say plainly, that I was the one standing here when it turned out to matter. Sarah looked at him for a long moment, the particular steadiness in his face that she had noticed the first morning he climbed down from the wagon, and simply looked at her land before saying a word to anyone. You could go back to Cheyenne tomorrow, she said quietly. Your work here is finished. The line is corrected. The bank has already restructured the note. I could, Gideon said. I find I am not in any particular hurry to. Neither am I. In a hurry for you two, Sarah said, and something in the plain honesty of it, the lack of any decoration around the words, seemed to settle between them more firmly than a longer speech would have managed. They were married the following June, in the small church at Larkin's Ford, on a morning when the whole valley had turned green after a wet spring, the ridge above the house thick with grass that even the doubters could no longer pretend was worthless ground. Old Pruitt attended, and made a point afterward of telling anyone who would listen that he had suspected all along the Vantine section was worth more than its reputation, a claim nobody in the valley quite believed, but nobody troubled to argue with either. Ashford Doane did not attend, though he had, in the months since the courthouse steps, quietly arranged to pay a fair yearly rate for his herd's continued use of the spring, an arrangement Sarah accepted without triumph. Warren Tolliver stood near the back of the small church, and told anyone who asked that he had simply made a sound business decision in restructuring the note, though he never quite managed to explain, when pressed, why a sound business decision left a banker looking as moved as he did watching Sarah walk down that short aisle. Ivy grew up largely on that ridge above the house, learning to read a compass properly by the time she was 8, and to understand why a stone mound mattered more than convenient talk in town. She called Gideon Papa within the year, without anyone asking her to, and kept Michael's old unfinished letter folded carefully in a small box of her own, beside the compass Gideon had taught her to use. Sarah kept the strongbox too, on a shelf in the front room, Michael's sketch of the boundary still inside it beside Gideon's official survey, 2 documents drawn 24 years apart by 2 careful men, who had each insisted the truth of that ridgeline mattered enough to go looking for it properly. She told visitors, when they asked, that the box held the difference between a decade of being called stubborn and a lifetime of being proven right. The spring still ran year-round on the ridge above the house, the water just as clear and just as steady as it had been for 24 years, while nobody troubled to ask whose ground it actually sat on. Sarah walked up there most evenings after supper, sometimes with Ivy trailing behind asking questions about bearings and witness trees, sometimes with Gideon's hand in hers, and she would stand for a while looking down at the water the way Michael must have stood there once, certain of something he could not yet prove, patient enough to leave the proof behind for whoever came looking after him. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.